Pessoal, estamos aqui para receber aí a Janice. Janice, thank you for your presence here. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So first, I just want to say thanks to Rodrigo and your team for putting together a full conference experience. You were not put off at all by it being a remote format. So we really appreciate that for everyone from the Kanban community, the international community. And I want to thank you for having me kick this great event off. It's really quite an honor. So get my screen organized here. There we go. So Rodrigo, as you may have introduced me, I don't speak Portuguese, so I am hoping that you explained that I am currently a manager at Salesforce, but I was heavily involved in the Kanban community for many years as one of the founders of Kanban University. And I also did the Posit Science experience, if you know that case study. So I have a long history with Kanban and the development of the Kanban method. But one thing that people don't always know about me is that I am also the administrator of the Limited WIP Society. And Limited WIP Society is an international community of Lean and Kanban enthusiasts, and it's made up of meetup groups and photo libraries and image libraries and all kinds of fun stuff. And the name Limited WIP Society refers to the practice of limiting WIP, limiting work in progress. And that is basically something that means we can handle this much. So we can work on this many work items at once. And we're not going to just keep starting more things. So there are so many benefits to limiting WIP. It's really practically magical. It improves, it makes us faster and better and helps us focus on finishing and just on and on and on. Limiting WIP is so important. It's one of the core practices of the Kanban method. It's second only to visualization. And even in lean manufacturing, there is a concept of limiting WIP. And there's this process, and it's meant to prevent a lot of inventory from piling up. And you have this card, and you signal that you want to replenish the stock, and that's called Kanban. So you can see that limiting WIP is a really, really big deal in our community. It's very important. Here's the thing, people don't do it. There are some, but even people who consider themselves to be really passionate Kanban users and they seek out Kanban software tools, even about 80% of them do not use WIP limits, or what they do is they will set them up and they will probably have every good intention to use them, but then they will just exceed them, and it's supposed to be a limit, but then there they are breaking the limit. But I get it. And I want to be clear, I am not here today to complain or to nag people or to beg people to use WIP limits. I understand it's hard. I mean, first of all, it's a number, and a number feels very precise. It feels like such a commitment. And there's a certain political risk within an organization. I mean, if it's a number that's supposed to mean this is how much I can do, or this is how much we are willing to take on, then what if your boss has a different point of view on that? But let's just say your boss is super on board and they want you to use WIP limits and all that. A WIP limit really is only as good as your understanding of the system. If you say, for example, that you want a WIP limit of 5, and then the next 5 things that come in are all different levels of complexity, or that maybe you don't understand the patterns of your work, so you might get a whole bunch of work and then nothing for a while, and what does your 5 mean at that point? And yet Kanban coaches tend to push people to come up with a WIP limit right away before they really have an understanding, and it's very scary for people. But I am wondering if a WIP limit should even be a number. Should it be about the number? Because what is a WIP limit really for? And really for all of Kanban, it really centers around this idea of balancing demand with capacity. That is, demand, the request for work to be done, with capacity, the ability to do the work. And for that, we really need to improve focus and flow. And I think one of the things that WIP limits do really well is they help in many ways to improve focus and flow. For example, if focus really, the definition really is to have an undivided attention and concentrated effort. And that limit forces you to really focus on what is the work that is right in front of you, rather than starting more and more things. And flow, when you don't have WIP limits, there's a tendency for work to really pile up in some places. And when you have WIP limits and you keep to those WIP limits, then that work will stream more evenly through the system. So it really helps move those customer requests through the workflow from request to fulfillment. But if we are not using WIP limits, how can we improve focus and flow? Well, random example here. If you're in the software industry and I show this to you, you probably already know what it is, that this is a support triage level. So we have P0, P1, P2, P3. You could probably even tell me something about this already, about the relative priorities. But the fact is there would be a lot of rules attached to each of these categories. There would be things like SLAs, which would already be signed on by the customer. There would be escalation paths. There would be how to handle the work after hours. I mean, there could be all kinds of things attached to this. And so this is a way of categorizing work in a system. And this is what we would call a class of service. So it's a set of rules telling us how we handle that work. So this is one of many ways that you could approach work. Even if you're not using WIP limits, it's probably better to use categories than to deal with individual work items, right? Because then you have fewer decisions, fewer things to manage because you're managing by categories. But this is just one example. There are many, many other techniques. The key is we need to understand our system before we can take action. So if you understand the different elements of your system, then you can apply things such as capacity allocation, demand shaping, and a bunch of other types of techniques. But the key is know your system in order to adjust it. So previously, I've done presentations on using Kanban for disaster management. I'm not exactly going to be talking about that today, but I did want to bring up this one thing that from those presentations, and that is the really the definition of a disaster, because it relates directly to this idea of balancing demand and capacity. So under normal circumstances, you have hopefully a fairly even proportion of customer demand to your capacity to handle that demand. In a disaster, something happens that suddenly and catastrophically increases customer demand when at the same time it reduces the capacity to handle the demand. So this is the definition for that international aid organizations use. This is how they understand it. So you can see how that would be, because if you had the capacity, then it wouldn't be much of a disaster, right? You would just deal with whatever the situation is. So this is a pattern that applies across all kinds of disasters, things like earthquakes and tsunamis and famine and pandemics. So I've found there are a lot of examples in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic that will illustrate some of the ways in which we can apply techniques to improve focus and flow and help to balance out demand and capacity. So if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, and we were advised that there were certain things that we needed to do, including social distancing. So one of the first things that happened was that government agencies classified into businesses into essential and non-essential. So for example, if you have a local medical center, that would be considered essential. If you have a local tattoo artist, that would be considered non-essential. And this would really be based on the services that they provide. So services became a part of this, of the classification. So also this concept of conditions. So services that were allowed had to be offered under certain conditions. So if normally a medical center would offer the services of emergency care, critical care, non-critical care, and elective care, then in phase one of the pandemic, in a lot of places, they were not offering all of those services. They were offering only emergency care and critical care, and even those had to be offered under certain conditions. And then as time went on and there were more phases, there were more services allowed. Meanwhile, on the non-essential side, in phase one, they just had to stay home. They just had to do social distancing. But I want to call your attention to the way that services were handled in phase one. What you see is not a WIP limit, it's kind of a capacity allocation, this limiting of services. So let me explain that. So capacity allocation is when you lay out all the different services that you offer, and then you assign a percentage of the capacity you want to devote to that service. So by capacity, I mean, in this case, it could be equipment, rooms, beds, staff, time and effort. So let's just make it easy. Let's just say 25% to each of 4 services. But then something happens and you want to change it to put more capacity on emergency care and critical care. But let's say in this example that we don't want to eliminate non-critical care and elective procedures. So let's reduce those down to 10% and increase the others. And that is typically how it is done in a capacity allocation. You reduce some services and you expand some others. So let's see how that would play out. So if somebody calls up, you call up and you say, I'm calling about my plastic surgery, and that's an elective procedure. And they would have to say, oh yes, we offer that service. Let's talk about your situation. Let's get you in for a preliminary appointment. And meanwhile, we've set aside rooms and beds and equipment and staff, all of that to support these non-critical and elective procedures. But meanwhile, because we've reduced them down to 10%, we're probably not delivering great service on it. So it's almost the worst possible scenario. We're still offering the service, but we're not offering it very well. So now what if we go to what was more typically done during the pandemic, which is the elimination of those kinds of non-critical services. Now, when someone calls, I know about this because I actually had to call not about plastic surgery, but about a non-critical procedure where I called up and they said, okay, we're going to book you for 4 months from now. And I said, 4 months? And they said, yes, because we're not doing that kind of procedure now. The whole conversation took about 1 minute, and it was very, very straightforward because they knew their policy and they were able to focus really all their energy on emergency care and critical care. Another thing to notice here is work in progress. Of course, we know there were a lot of people needing treatment. And so tremendous amount of WIP and not really the ability to limit WIP. So what can we do instead? Well, remember, we're trying to improve focus. So if focus is undivided attention, concentrated effort, then having this capacity allocation helps to focus everything on the more critical need. So when you can't limit WIP, you could try to limit context switching and improve focus in that way. So actually, it's quite a drastic move to stop doing services, but for a temporary period of time, it might be something that you could consider. And in your situations, if you're ever maybe not in a pandemic situation, but in some situation where you're expecting to be hit heavily with a lot of work in progress, it might be something you should think about. Is it possible that you can reduce or eliminate some of the services that you offer? So for any of these types of changes, you need to look at things like, what are the different elements of your system? What are your classes of service? What are the services that you offer? And what is your capacity allocation to the best of your knowledge? So understand your system, and then you can make intelligent choices. I see we have a couple of questions. So Rodrigo or Juliano, do you want me to pause and answer?
No, Janice, you can go ahead. We are going to answer that at the end, okay?
Okay, there should be some time at the very end
yes.
for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I was talking about focus, and there are obviously many other ways of improving focus, but I want to get to talking about flow and end-to-end flow specifically. So here's your Kanban system. How do you improve flow? Well, what is most often done is people try to work right in the middle. They work on that in-progress work. So they're looking for sources of delay, sources of disruption, and that's a really good thing to do. That's a good way to improve flow. But what about the ends on this end-to-end flow? What about the parts where the customer requests come in and the parts where we actually do delivery to customers? Because what I see happening a lot is there are disruptions at those points, delays and disruptions. So whereas we often will refer to, in the most basic level, to end-to-end as being, oh, incoming work that's to do, then there's a bunch of stuff in progress, and then it's done. Actually, I think we need to start looking at a lot more detail. And I'm not just talking about some of the more, things like test column or something, but really break down things like, what is it to make a request, a customer request? Because the customer makes a request, and then it is received, and then it is accepted. Those may or may not be the same steps. Like if you imagine something going into a backlog, it may not then come out to be accepted for a while. Then it is queued for WIP. Then we have this sort of mess of activities. And then we have delivery activities, which could be anything from when it's code complete to, or it could be just the deployment phase. But we have a bunch of delivery activities, and then the customer actually gets it. So I think what we need to do is really pay more attention to all three of these parts and invest more in developing all these, and I'll explain what I mean by invest. So for restaurants, traditionally, when they went to fulfill a customer request, this is basically what it looked like, right? It was very centralized. They would place an order. They would get their food, which would be made in the kitchen. It would then be delivered to them, and they were done. So it was all centralized. Of course, during the pandemic, restaurants had to get more creative about how service delivery was done. So this is a restaurant in Seattle where I live, and called Canlis, and it is a fine dining restaurant, very expensive, very exclusive. It has an award-winning 95-page wine list. How do you think a business like this would do during the pandemic when indoor dining was shut down in Seattle? What do you think they would do? Well, I will tell you what they did do. They actually, during that time period, experimented with 18 different business models, one after another, including things like they brought in sand to the parking lot to have an outdoor crab shack. They ran yurt villages. They started a drive-through window. They had a drive-in movie theater where they, of course, served food, and 12,000 people enrolled in Canlis Community College, which mainly consisted of their staff members teaching classes over YouTube on topics around food and wine and yoga and all kinds of other things. So in the case of Canlis, they did a really radical reimagining of service delivery. And they chose to prioritize their staff, their customers, and the local community. And they were willing to completely redefine end-to-end service delivery. But I think part of the reason that they had to get so extreme is because they were in such a segment of the market that was already very extreme. And they were so dependent on indoor dining, which was exactly the thing that was shutting down. But of course, many restaurants, while they may have been mainly doing indoor dining, they might have also been doing things like takeaway food, drive-throughs, delivery, or even just tables outdoors. But during the pandemic, they had to develop these other methods of delivery more to make up for the loss in what they had with indoor dining. So there's a name for this, and that's off-premises services, or I would call these actually channels, because I think services by our context is not exactly an accurate name for it, but get to channels. So the restaurants were supporting existing delivery services. They were growing new services, that were adding them. And this all makes sense, because they were, by distributing how they did things, they had better risk management, they had better consumer choices. So before I was talking about how great it is to reduce services in the medical example, but here I'm saying expand and add services. So the point is, you need to lay out all the different ways that you provide services, that you deliver to your customers, and look at the trade-offs of what it means to increase or reduce those services. So what about orders, though? I talked a lot about delivery. What about the customer request? Restaurants like McDonald's and Starbucks, long before the pandemic, had identified that the cashier, even a good cashier, could really only handle one order at a time. So they had already started experimenting with things like digital kiosks and mobile apps and food delivery services and all kinds of other things, which were all alternate ways that people could place an order. And they effectively moved the bottleneck from the cashier to the kitchen. And that's better, because if the cashier is the bottleneck, you end up with a line of customers out the door, and nobody wants to be in that line. So this way it distributed the methods for placing orders. So how do you improve flow? If you are a restaurant, it may end up looking something like this. So you have a lot of different methods of ordering, different channels for delivering. And it's not even like a Kanban board with a neat swim lane, because there are all different combinations of these. I mean, you know, there are all different ways this can go. But here's the thing, your capacity is always limited. It doesn't matter that you don't have WIP limits. The fact is your capacity is still limited. So how can, in a world where we want to reduce context switching and we want to consider capacity allocation, how could these businesses support so many different types of delivery and so many different types of orders? Because for each one, they've had to really stop and think about how it would work, and they had to do the training and get the equipment and all that kind of stuff. So QSR is an industry journal for the restaurant industry. And what they have said is they predict that restaurants will go back to indoor dining, but they will still have more off-premises services. Higher off-premises sales, but not at the expense of the indoor dining. Now, how is that possible? They're saying that many delivery, digital, and takeout hurdles are gone because the businesses have developed these channels, and a fully developed channel uses less capacity, and that's why it doesn't take away from the indoor dining experience. So for example, they would add infrastructure in some case, like in this example, looking at mobile app. This makes it easier, more obvious for customers and for the staff as to how this is going to work. So improves quality and makes it just a more comfortable experience. There's also a lot of software now that restaurants are using to monitor all of these different channels. So everything from, they know when the Uber Eats driver is arriving, and they can have an order ready, but also they can look at things like patterns of demand. So you might think that if a business had an existing channel already, like drive-through or something, that they'd be all set. But actually, the demand spiked so much during the pandemic that they had to change the way that they did, that they even ran those channels. So for things like drive-throughs, they had to upgrade the technology, make some changes to that. And a lot of places use these things, these ghost kitchens, which are really just it's like a restaurant with a kitchen, except no customers come to it. That's why it's called a ghost kitchen. And the purpose of it is so that they can make more food to specifically satisfy delivery orders. So it is all about just increasing capacity to meet the increased demand. So fully developed channels require less capacity, little counterintuitive, sort of like WIP limits are counterintuitive. But if you consider that you can ask these questions for all the different ways that you deliver and that your customers make requests, is it comfortable and familiar to them, or they feel confused or uneasy? Is there infrastructures? And in knowledge work, the version of this is probably policies. And you know, in the Kanban maturity model, policies are a big thing that we expect people to have when they're more mature. They have policies and they apply them consistently. So this is one way that you can focus that around these channels. Do you know the levels of demand? Do you know the range, at least, of how much demand? Or is it something that's untested, unknown, changing? Do you know what to do when something happens that isn't supposed to happen, or something goes wrong? Kind of like if you're in a line at the drive-through and the person in front of you is ordering hamburgers for the entire football team, then what are they going to do? It's not like the system doesn't allow that to happen, but it's going to cause a problem, so they need a plan. Monitoring, is there visibility? Is there a feedback loop on how this channel is going? Is there a way to make it automated or outsourced? And is it kept updated regularly? So imagine you have something like, maybe you're adding automated deployment or something like that. You could go through and look at all of these different aspects and say, are we making that investment to bring this capability up to the standard that it won't require so much work for us? So in technology and knowledge work, using again our example of P0, P1, P2, P3, you can look at how you deliver on different classes of service and say, are we doing a good job in all of these areas, or is there one or more that challenges us? And you can get more sophisticated also with it. You could look at things like work that has dependencies, work that uses certain equipment, certain technologies, work that's relating to certain customers. And the same with work requests. Now in knowledge work, we're probably not looking to add a lot more work requests, because we usually have a whole lot already. But I think it's worth looking at the format of those requests. If our goal here is to improve flow, then is it possible that the way the requests are coming in, are they well specified? Are they clear? Do they have any kind of initial investigation? Has that been done? So this is just, you really need to look at whatever it is that challenges you and ask the question, is that a channel that needs to be further developed? So when you are good at a channel, you can reduce the investment in it. And that means maybe you could have a more junior person on your team handling it. Maybe you can automate it, something like that. And that reduces capacity on that. When you are challenged by something, that's where you want to put more capacity on it to increase investment. So when you can get better at these different channels, then you can improve end-to-end flow. Okay. All right. So lastly, I want to talk about the individual in all of this, because definitely with WIP limits, this whole concept of a capacity limit, that refers to people, right? Whether it's an individual or a group, it really refers to, for the most part, to individuals and how much they can take on, without being overwhelmed, and with keeping the work moving. So the big topic, of course, lately is working from home. And I know not everybody has been working from home. I have been, but many people, and many knowledge workers specifically, have been. And I think it's interesting that it has been so much in the news and so much a point of discussion, because really what this is really about, it seems like, is this fear of letting employees out of your sight, fear of them not working as much as you would hope. And this kind of goes back to the scientific management idea and Taylorism, and I'm not going to get into all that, but basically there's just this concept that workers need to be closely managed. But really, a WIP limit and a pull system is so much about trust. It's so much about letting the workers make choices for themselves and making choices in collaboration with each other. So it's really kind of the opposite of this mentality. Now, when we looked at things like, there have been some studies around productivity with working from home, and whether it is true that people are going to be lazy and awful. But actually, we're finding the productivity's been pretty good, except then other research is showing that, Noel, maybe it's not so good. Maybe it's causing problems. In fact, the exact same person at Stanford who had originally said that productivity was going well with working from home now is saying that there are problems with it. So which is it? And is productivity what matters anyway? And is working from home improving focus and flow, or is it is it impossible to focus when you're at home with all the distractions at home? So this is Dr. Tracy Brower, and she is an author and an expert in organizational culture. And she has been doing some really interesting writing about the work from home productivity question. And she does have some criticisms of the possibility of how well that's going to go. But I wanted to share some of her points. First of all, we're talking so much about productivity, but we should be talking about performance, which includes productivity, but it also includes things like learning and innovation and growth. And those should all be counted and encouraged just as much as productivity. So we should be giving workers opportunities and recognition to have those as well, which really means allowing capacity for things such as learning and growth and innovation. Another point is, are we talking about individual productivity or organizational productivity? So organizational productivity actually has more impact, and that is has to do with communicating and coordinating across teams, across departments, across the organization, things like managing dependencies. So we need to just remember to not focus so much on individual productivity and forget about those connections across the organization. So emphasizing the whole value stream and having a communication plan to connect teams. And lastly, are we talking about complex tasks or routine tasks? Because a lot of the research that was done is looking at routine tasks. And it's, most knowledge work is really much more about complex tasks. So this is something where we need to be more deliberate about identifying what parts of our work are more routine and what parts of our work require co-creation. And then we can plan accordingly and maybe do the more routine work at home alone and organize, whether it's online or in person or whatever, to do the complex co-creation together. So this is all just another level of knowing your system. This is about individual communication, capacity for learning, and planning for collaboration. So this is just another way that you can evaluate your capacity allocation and how your system works together. Okay, so I'm gonna very quickly go through just 5 additional things for focus and flow that don't use WIP limits. First of all, of course, visibility. You should, anytime you run into a challenge in Kanban, you should always start with, is this fully visible, including data? Or do we have metrics and such on telling us how we're doing? Do we have that feedback loop? So start with visibility. Reduce batch sizes of releases. Reduce batch sizes of as many things as possible. Don't split your team members between teams. So what this means is that if we put people on multiple teams, then they could be unavailable. They will be doing a lot of context switching. So as much as possible, keep people devoted. This was something, a big topic that came up in the Posit Science case study, that this idea of being able to focus on projects. Treat specialists as shared services. So this is sort of the opposite of the last one. If there are people who are going to be on multiple teams because they are specialists or there's some good reason for it, then treat them that way. Make sure everyone knows, give them their own Kanban board, and make that an official thing. And lastly, plan less than 100% utilization. You are essentially reserving capacity for issues to happen, for variation. And so by planning something like 80% utilization, you're allowing for issues that might come up. Or you could also just limit WIP, because that would take care of a lot of these things. And that would be, in fact, if you could do that and to do these other techniques, then you would really be doing amazing things. So wrapping up, obviously there's nothing terrific about the pandemic, but from a management perspective, it was really fascinating and continues to be really fascinating in terms of risk management, balancing demand and capacity. I didn't even get into supply chain, but that's obviously a big thing. And workplace culture, I mean, there's just all kinds of management related things. So it becomes really the sort of a big experiment in adapting systems for service delivery. So did society limit WIP? Well, I would say yes, but not by choice. The circumstances really required us to rethink service delivery, to think harder about the way we worked, to change our focus, and to really start with understanding in order to adapt. Thank you. And I think there's time for questions.
Oh yes. Janice, thank you for your presentation here. I really enjoyed all that you shared. You know that one of the things that I missed a lot during the pandemic was going to the restaurant, you know, this experience with the waiters, you know, serving you. I think that this is one of the most, things that I missed during the pandemic. So yes, we have some questions. In fact, we have 3 questions. Daniel Silva, he asked about the, there's a lot of things coming. Guys, please put the questions on the Q&A, please. Pessoal, coloca a pergunta no Q&A, tá? So let's see. Daniel asked about what is the link for the research that you shared. Do you have it?
I'm not sure which research he is referring to. Which.
Okay.
I will put some resources on the slide deck. I assume you're sharing the slides.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So I'll make sure that there's a link with
okay.
different things.
So. Janice, the first question was about, this is a classic one. How do we find the first number for our WIP experiment? You know,
yes.
If we do that by the number of people, it's okay. This is the basic, the most basic question about WIP. People that are going to start with, so it's a pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, David Anderson used to say that the number to start with is 3, because it was the most common worldwide. But I think there's so many different approaches on this. I mean, there's some people say to start with 1 for each person on the team, and plus some, but so much of it has to do with the type of work and with the way you work together. So maybe I think I would start with considering the maturity level. Okay. And so if you would describe your team as being working a little more in silos, and maybe not having a lot of formal policy and all that, then probably they would be lower on the scale, and they might benefit from a per person WIP limit at that point. But if they are good at working together and collaborating on policy, then I'm sure they could come up with something together. The key is pick something and be ready to adjust it. And that's, I think, where things fall apart, is people are so scared. They feel like they're making a commitment, but in fact, you can change it. You can change it. It's all an experiment. You need to get into this mindset of scientific method.
Okay. You know that usually I see two heuristics emerging. If you have a lot of WIP, first you need to, lower it down a little bit. So then you start this kind of experiments and, start dancing with the number to see what happens. Okay.
Yeah, one other
Okay.
thing about that was just that the other thing is, think about more input queues before the work gets to in progress, where you can funnel it down and you can say, because people often will pull things like right from the backlog, or they'll, or something, they'll have these huge input queues. And if you can reduce it down more and more, then that will help you when it gets to the point of being in progress.
Yeah, perfect. Let me see another one. This one is from Victor. He put it in Portuguese, so I need to translate that. What is your suggestion to define the capacity allocation? First you start with all this information, and then you start collecting metrics, and then you go on. Or if you have any other suggestion, what is up? Basically, it's how do you define the capacity for each, swim lane or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the trick with that, like with what I showed, was without a WIP limit, it's hard to even know the percent, that you're on track with a percentage. So part of the value of a WIP limit is it limits the number of tickets, so you know that you're at 25% or something. But if you want to be a little more, not so precise with it, then I think most people will, if you just ask, you could say, oh, how much of your time do you spend on support tickets? And they'll say, about half of my time. Or they'll say, or about, but most people are able to come up with a percentage more easily than they are able to come up with a precise WIP limit, because that is such a precise number. So I would say, again, sort of the same answer, just start with something. And if you realize that, wow, we're spending a lot of our time already on a certain type of work, and we don't have the support in place for that, that should trigger some action. That should be where you say, oh, okay, we better be supporting that more, putting more people on it, or whatever, if that work is taking up more of our should be taking up more of our energy.
Thank you. I think that we have time for just another question. This is from Gustavo. Gustavo is a KCP, Janice, KMM maps capacity allocation to higher maturity environments, but I see many low maturity environments also benefit from it. So do you have any thoughts about how can introduce, capacity allocation for low maturity environment, or you just can comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the last one, actually. It's like, I would just ask people the question of how much of your work already, either how much of your work or how much of your time is going to these different categories, and start with that. Because if you say, we are now going to formally set up a capacity allocation, it's going to scare them, so just sort of have a conversation about, oh, let's talk about your work. And they know, like they will know how much they're spending on different things, or how much they feel the work is queuing up.
Okay. I think that's it, Janice. Thank you for your time. Thank you to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you.
I see that the feedback is quite positive of your talk. You bring a lot of things that it's aligned with the theme of the conference. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Okay, great.